Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 396. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about in today's show. The U.S. is moving towards war with North Korea, Russia, and China, so I'll be breaking all of that down with the latest stories. Just share the show. You can find it at antiwar.com or the Libertarian Institute. YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee is where you can find the video version of the show. And it's up everywhere you can listen to podcasts. So if you're new, just go ahead and subscribe. If you've been a listener for a while, share this episode out. Help me to get some more people listening to the show. All right, first story up today. I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on March 13th. All right, so I write, tensions on the Korean Peninsula are spiraling. Pyongyang has launched 2 missiles from a submarine, whilst Washington and Seoul have opened massive military drills in South Korea. North Korea believes there is a realistic chance of nuclear war, and the U.S. is deploying more strategic assets to the region. On Monday, American and South Korean troops opened joint military drills. Dubbed Full Eagle, the war games are the largest such drills the two countries have held since 2018. Under President Donald Trump, the maneuvers were canceled to provide fertile ground for diplomacy with Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. However, President Joe Biden has a more bellicose policy towards Pyongyang. In the past 2 years, the U.S. has resumed live-fire war games, conducted missile tests, deployed strategic platforms to the Korean Peninsula, threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea, and has failed to offer Pyongyang any acceptable terms for diplomacy. Kim has reacted sharply to Biden's threats and increased military activity on the peninsula. Last year, North Korea conducted a record 69 missile tests. Some of the rockets were fired over Japanese territory. Pyongyang additionally tested an underwater silo that could launch nuclear-capable missiles. Last month, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un, said the war games would force Pyongyang to respond. The demonstrative military moves and all sorts of rhetoric by the U.S. and South Korea, which go extremely frantic as not to be overlooked, undoubtedly provide North Korea with the conditions of being forced to do something to cope with them, she said. In addition, she warned, the frequency which North Korea uses the Pacific Ocean as a firing range depends directly on U.S. forces and other action character. In the days after Kim's remarks, American and South Korean military officials announced the Full Eagle war games. Washington will deploy an aircraft carrier to the region and send Reaper drones to the peninsula for the first time. The North Korean leader said the military drills were frantic war preparation moves. Washington and Seoul maintained the games served a defensive purpose. On Sunday, Pyongyang launched 2 missiles from a submarine, although South Korea says it only tracked 1 projectile. According to The Hill, last week, the U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that North Korea had been timing its missile tests to coincide with U.S. and South Korean military joint exercises. In November, the U.S. and South Korea conducted the Vigilant Storm military air drills. Pyongyang tested an intercontinental ballistic missile in response. Washington and Seoul then extended the war games, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. would increase its military presence on the peninsula. So I'm not sure if the U.S. military intelligence community really had no idea until last week that North Korea carries out these tests and fires missiles in response to what they, see as U.S. and South Korean military provocations against North Korea. And a lot of these things I think are pretty clearly identified as, military provocations. A lot of these operations that they carry out are meant to be shows of force against North Korea to tell, Pyongyang, hey, we will obliterate you with nuclear weapons if war breaks out. And so that lack of insight, combined with the fact that the only prescription the Biden administration has to deal with North Korea is to increase military deployments to the region, basically means this is just going to escalate and escalate and escalate. And if you look at the rhetoric of North Korea, they're saying, hey, we are getting very close to war. And so it definitely, seems that North Korea is one place we could potentially see a war break out in the coming months, if not, years here. Now, next up, I got a story about Russia that's very important. All right, so we had a major international event yesterday. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. drone crashes in Black Sea after encounter with Russian fighters. The U.S. European Command said Tuesday that a U.S. Air Force MQ-9 Reaper drone collided with a Russian Su-27 fighter jet. The Russian Defense Ministry denied the idea that the aircraft came in contact and said the drone crashed into the water after making a sharp maneuver. And I did see a video that alleges to show this incident, and it doesn't appear that the Russian fighter jet actually hits the drone. It just passes so closely that it causes the propeller to fly off of the drone. Now, maybe this is an altered video or something like that, but assuming that video is correct, there wasn't any actual contact. There were a lot of reports in Western media that just used the phrase that, the Russian plane downed the American drone, which doesn't really seem to be a correct description of what happened at all. So back to Dave's article here. European Command said in a press release that 2 Russian Su-27 fighter jets intercepted the drone at approximately 7:03 a.m. CET, which I'm guessing is local time in the Black Sea. One of the Russian Su-27 aircraft struck the propeller of the MQ-9, causing U.S. forces to have to bring it down in international waters, the command said. The Russian Defense Ministry said the drone was flying over the Black Sea near Crimea in a region that was declared off limits by Russia. It said Russian fighter jets were sent to intercept the MQ-9. The ministry said that as a result of a sharp maneuver, the U.S. drone went into an uncontrollable flight with a loss of altitude and crashed into the water. General James B. Hecker, the U.S. commander of U.S. Air Force in Europe and Africa, claimed the MQ-9 was conducting a routine flight and insisted that the aircraft collided. Our MQ-9 aircraft was conducting a routine operation in international airspace when it was intercepted and hit by the Russian aircraft, resulting in a crash and complete loss of the MQ-9, he said. In fact, this is an unsafe, unprofessional act by Russia that nearly caused both aircraft to crash. And remember, this is just a U.S. drone. So it's just money, it's just machinery, parts and stuff like that. And the U.S. is still making quite a big deal out of it. The U.S. and its allies conduct frequent surveillance flights in the Black Sea, sometimes close to Russian territory. The White House said the U.S. will continue to operate in the Black Sea despite the significant risk of escalating the war with Moscow. And so Dave wraps up his article with a quote from National Security Council advisor, the spokesperson John Kirby, who said, "We're going to continue to fly and operate in international airspace over international waters. The Black Sea belongs to no one nation. We are going to continue to do with our own national security interests in this part of the world." And so I think there's a lot of problems here. The first is that, of course, the U.S. is fighting a proxy war against Russia. The U.S. has talked about, helping Ukraine to attack Crimea. And so even if this drone is in international waters, I would understand why Russia would be very uncomfortable with the drone flying in that area, because it could in some way, not by firing a missile directly, but by providing surveillance, intelligence, intercepting communications or something like that, trying to give Ukraine the upper hand in an attack on Crimea, which Russia has very clearly insisted is a red line for them. So, it seems that the White House is saying that they're going to continue to do this, continue to create these unsafe encounters with Russia. And who knows, how long until either this is a manned American airplane that's having these close encounters with Russian fighter jets. And then, what happens if there's an incident, or, let's say the Russian fighter jet sustains significant damage or something. I do think it landed in Crimea, so I think it did sustain some damage, was the story that I read. Although, again, I did see the story from Russia that said that in the video that I believe was posted by Russia, that did show that it didn't appear there was any contact between the two aircraft. So anyways, but, if there was contact, it was very, very close that these two were flying. If the Russian pilot ends up getting killed, then what happens is there, louder calls for demand for increasing this war in Moscow, and that, that these could all be problems that could combine and escalate tensions, and who knows how far this thing could spiral. But the White House really seems to insist that we have to escalate tensions all the time with everyone. Next up, I think a very important story here. Ukrainian official says Kiev doesn't have resources for a counteroffensive. A senior Ukrainian government official told the Washington Post that Kiev doesn't have the resources to pull off a big counteroffensive in the coming months. as Ukraine is lacking skilled troops, munition, and other equipment. If you have more resources, you have a more active attack, the official said, who spoke with the Post on condition of anonymity. If you have fewer resources, you defend more. We're going to defend. That's why, if you ask me personally, I don't see a big counteroffensive for us. I like to believe in it, but I'm looking at the resources and asking with what. Maybe we will have some localized breakthroughs. The official said Ukraine doesn't have the people or weapons to pull off the counteroffensive, and you know the ratio. When you're on the offensive, you're twice or three times, you lose twice or three times as many people. We can't afford to lose that many people, the official said. And this is something that, not only has been brought to and kind of argued to Ukraine, that, they're going to have to, worry about losing too many men in this war, from, members of the anti-war community who, just don't want to see more death and destruction. But also the White House said, hey, you're spending a lot of resources, and when they say resources, they mean bodies, in this eastern city of Bakhmut, where, we read where it's commonly called a meat grinder from the Ukrainian side. That's not really a dispute or something that we just have one person quoted from. Now, we have that from a lot of people on the Ukrainian side, that this is a meat grinder, but we have a former American Marine saying that Ukrainian soldiers live about 4 hours once they reach the front lines in Bakhmut. We previously had intelligence in Berlin assess that Ukraine was losing a 3-figure number of soldiers, and who knows, somewhere between 100 and 999 soldiers in the city a day. And that was in January, when things didn't seem to be going quite so poorly in the city for Ukraine as it is now. So he also, Dave DeCamp here, included another small anecdote in his story when he said that a Ukrainian soldier said of his battalion that 500 troops, 100 were killed and 400 were wounded, leading to a complete turnover. He's now being sent with soldiers with no combat experience and very little training. I get 100 new soldiers, he said. They don't give me any time to prepare them. They say, take them into battle. They just drop everything and run. That's it. Do you understand why? Because the soldier doesn't shoot. I ask him why. He says, I'm afraid of the sound of the shot. He added the post. So, the Ukrainian commanders are saying that their soldiers are so unfamiliar with their weapons and so unprepared for warfare that when they hear the sound of their own rifle being fired, it scares them. And so the Post reporter said that Ukraine has sent an influx of draftees to replace the experienced soldiers who have been killed or wounded. It said that more Ukrainian men who didn't volunteer fear they will get called into battle. Ukraine's security services shut down Telegram accounts that were helping Ukrainians avoid locations where authorities were handing out draft slips. The Ukrainian soldier continued to say that Ukrainian forces were also fighting with very little ammunition. You're on the front lines, he said. They're coming towards you, and there's nothing to shoot with. The Kiev Independent also recently spoke with Ukrainian fighters who said they were fighting without much ammunition, training, or support. For those of you who didn't catch it, I was on the Scott Horton show, his KPFK show. That's his radio show that he does in Los Angeles this past week, last week. So it was last Thursday. And we talked about this a little bit and how significant it was that, the Kiev Independent is a very pro-Ukrainian outlet. They definitely puff up the stories that Kiev wants them to, and often border on just, putting out straight propaganda. And so, the Kiev Independent saying the war is going this poorly is an indication that it's likely happening. This isn't, in any way a Russian outlet. So, it's really unclear what the losses in Bakhmut are. Of course, it is possible that, it's possible that Russia is losing a lot more forces than Ukraine, and this could help Ukraine in the long run, but it does seem like Ukraine is taking some pretty heavy losses in Bakhmut. And from what I've seen, the Russian losses don't seem quite that significant. All right, next article up here. Kremlin says goals in Ukraine can only be achieved through military means. So this one, I think, is probably one of the more concerning stories I have to talk about today. The Kremlin said Monday that Russia's goals in Ukraine can only be achieved through military means at this moment, and ruled out the idea that peace talks were possible. For us, the absolute priority continues and will remain the achievement of goals set. At the moment, they can only be achieved through military means, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, according to the Russian news agency TASS. And so I feel like Russia has been putting this out more or less for the past 6 months. But, this is interesting because China is trying really hard right now. It seems at diplomacy for this war. They put forward their 12-point peace plan, which was kind of vague. But now the Chinese president is going to meet with Putin and speak with Zelensky. And so for Russia to say this now, it seems maybe they're actually trying to either communicate to China that they're not interested in the peace talks, and reassert that position, or they feel that the recent military, transfers from the West to Ukraine have made the war a little bit worse from the Russian perspective. So Peskov added, so far, there are no preconditions for transition of the process into a peaceful course. And I guess, they're looking at maybe ending Western weapons transfers or something like that before they're willing to actually sit down and talk with the Ukrainians. So Wolfgang Ischinger, a veteran German diplomat who served as the chair of the Munich Security Council conference, suggested it was time for Western countries to think about the peace process and establish a contact group to work towards peace negotiations. But at this point, the U.S. and other Western countries are leaving the issue of potential peace talks up to President Zelensky. And Zelensky says that Ukraine's going to recapture all of its territory and then force Russia into war crimes tribunals, which seems like an impossible demand to make. So it doesn't seem like we're really at this point anywhere near either side being where they need to be to consider engaging in peace talks. Next up, another decamp article here. China Xi's to speak with Zelensky, meet with Putin. Chinese President Xi Jinping plans to speak with Ukrainian President Zelensky for the first time since the Russian invasion of Ukraine was launched. The report, which cited people familiar with the matter, says Xi is also planning to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow next week and will likely hold his talks with Zelensky following his trip to Russia. The report indicates Xi is looking to mediate between the two sides after Beijing released a 12-point peace plan for the conflict in Ukraine that will focus on pause in fighting and a resumption of peace talks. Zelensky expressed openness to the Chinese proposal, but was dismissed by President Biden and other U.S. officials. Biden rejected the idea of China mediating an end to the war that would solely benefit Russia. So, the West has said that China can't be the mediator here because they haven't done enough to condemn Russia, which, is ridiculous. And that's actually one of the few things that maybe makes it possible for China to be the mediator here. But I don't see the West putting enough pressure on Zelensky to move forward here. And I also don't see Russia having the interest in this point. It seems that the fighting on the ground is going in Russia's favor. And so why would they stop and talk if they're winning the war and the other side isn't willing to make a substantial number of concessions? In another major escalation in the proxy war in Ukraine, Poland says it may send MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine in 4 to 6 weeks. On Tuesday, Polish Prime Minister said Warsaw could give Soviet-made MiG-29 fighter jets within 4 to 6 weeks to Ukraine, a step that would mark a significant escalation in NATO support for Kiev. The Prime Minister said Poland wanted to transfer the jets as a part of a coalition, suggesting it would only happen if other NATO countries went along with it. Slovakia has previously said it's open to sending its MiG-29 jets to Ukraine. Ukrainian pilots are trained to use the MiG-29, so jets can be used in battle immediately once they arrive in Ukraine, but it's not clear how long the process of delivering the aircraft would take. In March 2022, Poland offered to give MiG-29s to the U.S. to send to Ukraine, but the idea was rejected over the Pentagon over concerns of escalation. NATO diplomats told CNN at the time that providing Ukraine with the fighter jets could be perceived by Russia as an alliance directly entering the war. But 1 year later, NATO countries are less concerned about escalation. The US and its allies are laying the groundwork to eventually provide Kiev with advanced Western-made fighter jets such as F-16s, which will require extensive training for Ukrainian pilots. Ukrainian pilots have already arrived in the US to assess their skills to learn how long it would take them to train on American fighter jets. More and more European countries equipped with US fighter jets are expressing openness to sending them to Ukraine. Finnish Prime Minister said Monday that she was open to giving Ukraine Finland's F-18 Hornet jets once they are replaced with F-35s. And so I do wonder if that's going to be the, 1 to 6 month solution will be to start to either give contracts to these countries or, actually make deliveries of F-16s, F-35s and stuff like that. And in replacement, Poland will get F-16s or Finland will get F-35s, and then these older fighter jets will end up going to Ukraine. All right, next up here, Pentagon's next budget puts focus on munitions production as war in Ukraine depletes stockpiles. The Pentagon's 2024 budget request plans to focus on munitions production as shipping tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment to Ukraine has depleted U.S. stockpiles. According to The Hill, the budget includes $30.6 billion that would go towards arms makers to produce missiles and other type of munitions, representing a 12% increase from 2023 levels. The budget will continue what has been dubbed wartime purchasing powers for the Pentagon that allows for more multi-year contracts for weapons and waives other restrictions. The purchasing powers were first authorized by the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. The Pentagon is planning a drastic increase in munition manufacturing and hopes to increase artillery production by over 500% in the next 2 years, an example of how supporting Ukraine is a boon to the U.S. defense contractors. The U.S. provided Ukraine with an enormous number of artillery rounds, including over 1 million 155 millimeter shells. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has acknowledged that the entire alliance cannot produce shells as fast as Ukraine is using them. President Biden requested $886.4 billion in his 2024 military budget, including $842 billion for the Pentagon. Congress will likely raise that number as it has the previous 2 years. All right, one more quick war in Ukraine story before we move on to talk about China. Sweden says it's more likely Finland will join NATO before them. And we've talked about this a lot. Initially, when these two countries applied to join NATO, the idea was that they would join, they had joint bids, so they would join together. Well, it now appears that because of Turkey's, position where they want Sweden to make a bunch of concessions around their Kurdish population, not supporting the PKK or the YPG in Syria, deporting various Kurds that Turkey says are involved in those organizations. And Sweden has been tentative to do that. Part of the reason is there is a Kurdish member of the Sweden legislature that I believe was critical, actually, was the deciding vote in actually supporting the ruling coalition in Sweden holding on to power. And one of the concessions that she was able to extract was that Sweden wouldn't give in to all of these Turkish demands. Now, Sweden has started to give in. I don't think that one person is probably enough to stop the flood. But at the same time, Sweden has dragged their feet a little bit more and been a little bit tentative to give in to all of Turkey's demands, where Finland doesn't have as many issues on the Kurdish side as Sweden does. So there just haven't been as many hiccups. Turkey and Hungary are the only two members that have not ratified Sweden and Finland joining the alliance. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Hungary. As I suspect, they're trying not to have to make a decision here. I think they would prefer if Hungary would prefer if Turkey, decided not to allow the two states in NATO, and then they didn't have to upset either Moscow or Washington by deciding one way or the other on that NATO membership. So we'll see what happens here in the coming months, but I think it's going to be a while before either of these states are in NATO, particularly Sweden. Now let's move on to some China news before we wrap up here today. This is a big story. Former Trump official says U.S. would destroy Taiwan's semiconductor facilities if China invades. Robert O'Brien, Donald Trump's former national security advisor, has said that the U.S. would destroy Taiwan's advanced semiconductor manufacturing facilities if China launched a successful invasion of the island. The United States and its allies are never going to let those factories fall into the hands of China, O'Brien told Sem4. O'Brien, who served as national security advisor from 19 to 21, drew a comparison with the British bombing of the French naval fleet off the coast of Algeria in 1940 to prevent the ships from coming under Nazi control. The British bombardment killed nearly 1,300 French soldiers. The British didn't allow the French fleet to remain intact, so it could potentially have gone to the Germans and changed the balance of power in the battle for the Atlantic. O'Brien said that Taiwan is the home of the world's most advanced chip manufacturing facilities that China took control. It would take them like the new OPEC of silicon chips and give Beijing more control over the world economy. He said he couldn't imagine if the factories remained intact after China took the island. And so my guess is that in the process of China taking back the island, should they do so militarily, a lot of these facilities would be damaged or destroyed in that military conflict. I do wonder, though, if there was a peaceful reunification process or something like that, what the U.S. plan would be here. Although my understanding is a lot of that chip, the importance of the Taiwanese chip manufacturing is really blown out of proportion, and more of that is being built in the United States all the time. Now, China appoints new defense minister who is under U.S. sanctions. China on Sunday named a new defense minister, a general who has been under U.S. sanctions since 2018, overseeing China's purchase of Russian military equipment. And so this is one of the problems with the massive U.S. sanctions campaign, is it prevents any diplomacy from happening between opposing sides, because we now have so many Chinese officials sanctioned that these people probably are personally less interested in talking with the United States, since they have been personally targeted by Washington. Next up here, Dave DeCamp, March 14th, antiwar.com. U.S. Philippines annual military drill will be the biggest ever. And so not only are we carrying out massive war games right now in Korea, which is, really close to Chinese territory. And while, that is more seen provocatively by Pyongyang, I'm sure China isn't happy with U.S. Reaper drones on the Korean Peninsula, isn't happy when U.S. aircraft carriers are in the region. So we're also going to carry out these major war games in the Philippines the month after we wrap up the war games in Korea. So the annual Balakintan exercises will be held from April 11th to the 28th, and about 17,000 military personnel will take part, including 12,000 American troops. About 111 Australian troops will also take part. This is officially the largest exercise, said Philippines Colonel Michael Lucio, a spokesperson for the exercises. He said the drills will include live fire exercises into the water for the first time. The previous largest exercises took place in more than 2015 and included 11,000 troops. The planned exercises come after the U.S. signed a deal with the Philippines government of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., which gave the U.S. access to 4 more military bases in the Philippines, part of Washington's build-up against China. Now, a more significant part of the U.S. military buildup against China is the AUKUS agreement, and we have a major update to that this week. On Monday, the U.S., Britain, and Australia unveiled their plans to develop a nuclear-powered submarine under AUKUS, a military pact the 3 countries signed in September 2021 to coordinate advanced military technology against China. President Biden and then the British Prime Minister Sunak and the Australian Prime Minister Albanese formally announced the plans at the U.S. Naval Base in San Diego. The ultimate goal is for Australia to begin producing a new type of nuclear-powered submarine known as SSN AUKUS that isn't expected to happen until the 2040s, though. According to the joint statement released by the three leaders, the first part of the plan will be for Australia to embed personnel with the US Navy and British Royal Navy for training on the submarines. The US plans to increase its submarine ports visits to Australia, and starting in 2027, British and American navies will begin forward rotations of submarine deployments to Australia. In the early 2030s, the U.S. will sell 3 of its Virginia-class submarines to Australia with the option of selling up to 2 more. By the late 2030s, the U.S. plans to deliver the first British-built SSN AUKUS submarine, followed by Australian-produced version in the 2040s, and Australian military officials said it's best to spend up to $245 billion on the initiative by 2055. And now let's get to the Chinese response. This is my last article today. China says AUKUS countries are going down a dangerous path. This is the statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin. He says the latest joint statement issued by US, the UK, and Australia showed the 3 countries, for their own geopolitical interests, have totally disregarded the concerns of the international community and gone further down the wrong and dangerous path. And so, look, if we look at what's going on in the Indo-Pacific, with the Korean Peninsula, with the buildup against China, and then the proxy war in Ukraine, the Biden administration has put us where we are on the verge of 4 major wars at this point, because I would also consider Iran, even though we've turned the dial down 2 or 3 notches probably with the Saudi-Iran deal that China brokered, but still, I do think it probably turned the temperature down in the Middle East, because Saudi going along with Israel would make an attack on Iran, I think, a lot more possible. It'll be a lot more problematic and probably strategically difficult if Saudi Arabia has decent ties with Iran and isn't willing to go along with any of the Israeli plans to attack Iran. So maybe we've turned the dial down there, but everywhere else has been turned up. With this incident in the Black Sea with the drone, the American response saying that we're going to continue to do it in the Korean Peninsula with the largest war games in 5 years, in the Philippines with the largest war games ever, the AUKUS agreement. We are really ramping up towards major conflict. And look, these are all nuclear powers. I guess, not Iran, obviously, but North Korea, Russia, and China are. And we could lose a lot of people. A lot of Americans could die in these wars, and we have to demand that the White House rein it in and end some of this very hawkish aggression. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for tuning in.